Hi, my name is Jason Abraham and I'm one of the owners of Hupy and Abraham. It's my pleasure to be here today to talk to you about insurance coverage. We've represented thousands of people and received hundreds of millions of dollars for our clients. We have offices in Wisconsin and Illinois, and people from around the country come to us to ask us to represent them. One of the ways we give back to the community is through education programs like this to make sure people are educated consumers before an accident would happen. Before I talk to you about the specifics of insurance coverage, I want to let you know that with offices in Wisconsin and Illinois, this presentation will focus on those laws. Laws are different from state to state and vary from time to time. So consult a lawyer immediately in the event that you have an accident if there are some specific legal questions you need answered. When it comes to insurance policies, it's important that every single person be educated at the time they purchase their insurance. Most people become educated to their insurance policies, unfortunately, after an accident happens. By then, it's too late. So at this time, I'd like to look at a policy and go through the terms so everyone understands what they mean and can buy the right amount of insurance and at least have an understanding of all the important terms. I would like to start out by looking at my policy as an example. If you see on the screen, you will see a deck page from my exact policy. The first section that I want to talk about is under the liability section. And you can see there that I have $250,000, $500,000 of coverage. That insurance is what's called a split limit policy. It means no one person can get more than the first number, the $250,000. And then no matter how many people are injured in an accident, the most the insurance company will have to pay is the second number, or the $500,000. You can buy insurance in another way, which is called a single limit policy, where if you look at the limits of liability on your deck page, it will just have one number. And that would be that one person can get $500,000, and regardless of how many people are injured in the accident, the most the insurance company will pay is $500,000. Conceptually, you will see that that is more coverage because there is no limit to the amount the first person would get. So when buying insurance, you can buy it either way, but at least now you'll know what that means under the liability section. Again, when we typically buy insurance and we think about liability, what that means is if I'm involved in an accident and I hurt somebody else, that's the amount of insurance there is available in the event someone is injured and I am at fault. When you're determining what amount of insurance to buy for liability, it really requires a detailed analysis of the assets you have in determining the amount of insurance you want to buy. If you own a $500,000 home and have a good income, and you want to protect all that, buying $100,000 of insurance will not do that. So make sure when you're determining the amount of liability insurance to buy that you think about the assets you have now and the assets you have into the future, because any case that is brought against you will take a substantial amount of time to conclude. So make sure you do that detailed analysis when determining the amount of insurance to buy. The second type of coverage I want to talk about is property damage. And it's usually the third number along those lines that we talked about in the split limit policy, which was $250,000, $500,000, and then the next number is the property damage number. And that is pretty self-explanatory, but that will protect you in the event that you damage someone else's vehicle to that amount. Along the property damage lines is also collision coverage. And that would protect your vehicle in the event that you have an accident that's your fault. That collision coverage will pay the damages up to your limit. Now, one thing to think about if you have a motorcycle is when you buy property damage coverage, you want to think about the extras and the add-ons that you would have when you purchase that motorcycle to make sure the property damage figure that you insure your vehicle for encompasses all of those extras. And the same with your car. There are a lot of things we can do to vehicles to improve them and make them our own, and you want to make sure you have the right amount of property damage coverage to protect yourself. There's also another component of that called comprehensive, and that is if it's your vehicle's in the garage and it gets damaged, when you're not operating it, you have insurance coverage for that. If there's a hailstorm or other things along those lines, comprehensive will protect you for those type of damages. Those coverages have deductibles, and think about when and if you'd make a claim in determining the deductible you would want to have. In the event you know that you're not going to make a claim if the damage is $350, then there's really no reason to have a deductible at $250. Push your deductible as high as you feel comfortable to make sure that you reduce your rates and buy as much insurance as possible. Another type of coverage you can buy is what's called MedPay. And that is important if you don't have health insurance for sure, because if you're involved in an accident that would be your fault and you're injured and you don't have any health insurance, the MedPay coverage you have on your vehicles would apply. This coverage is substantially more expensive when you're on a motorcycle, unfortunately, because the risk of injury is higher. So you really have to look when determining how much MedPay, or if you want MedPay, determine how much it's going to cost and ask yourself that if you have to pick and choose between more coverage or having MedPay, that you consider that when making your informed decision. As I've said before, and I'll continue to say throughout this presentation, it's very, very critical to be an informed, educated consumer. When you go in to buy insurance from your agent, you should be telling your agent what you want. You should never be relying on your agent to determine the amount of insurance you have because your agent doesn't know your financial circumstances, your agent doesn't know how much money you owe, your agent doesn't know what your monthly expenditures are when determining how much coverage you want to have to protect yourself in the event you're injured. So be an educated consumer. Now, when we talk about insurance coverage, we can talk about two different things. The first half, which we've talked about, liability, protecting ourselves if we hurt others. The second part, which is equally as important, is protecting ourselves in the event somebody hurts us and they do not have the right amount of insurance or enough. And substantial number of people driving today have very little amount of insurance because when they go into the insurance agent to buy the coverage, they ask for full coverage. And the agents understand that when you're in buying, you may be shopping other companies, getting quotes online. So what they do is they give you the cheapest policy they can sell you, more than likely, that has all the different aspects, but the limits are just not that high or not high enough. So you need to know what you want, and you need to fully understand these definitions and what the words mean when making this decision. So talking about when someone doesn't have any insurance at all, they're uninsured. You know, that definition is pretty easy to understand. If you're involved in an accident with someone that doesn't have any insurance, they're an uninsured motorist. And you can buy insurance to protect yourself from an uninsured motorist. How do we do that? What's the appropriate way to look at that? Well, what you want to do is look at all your assets and determine what amount of insurance you want to have, and then you can buy it in that limit. And we'll talk about those concepts a little later. But first, just to understand, uninsured motorist means someone doesn't have any insurance, they cause an accident, and you can buy insurance to protect yourself for that. The next concept to talk about is what's called underinsured motorist, and that's a little more complicated. That circumstance comes about that if you're involved in an accident and someone has a small policy and your damages are greater than that small policy, you can protect yourself and your family from this kind of circumstance by buying underinsured motorist coverage. So if the person that hurts you doesn't have enough insurance and your injuries are greater than that, you can have a policy in place to step in and treat you as if the person that hurt you had enough insurance. And this is real important to understand because this is something that can vary, as I talked about at the beginning of this video, from state to state and from time to time. Insurance companies sometimes are able to write definitions that minimize what you can get here. So the best advice I can give any consumer is buy as much insurance as you can afford to protect you and your family. One such example of a definition is something called the reducing clause. This clause is usually buried in your policy under the underinsured motorist section, and it allows the insurance company to reduce the amount of insurance you may be able to get when someone hurts you without enough insurance. Let's go through some examples so we can understand this concept more thoroughly. At the outset, let's assume that if there was enough money, the total value of your claim would be $150,000. The way the reducing clause works is as follows. In the event the person that hurts you has $100,000 of insurance, you can see that that is not enough insurance to fully compensate you for your injuries. Let's say you have $50,000 of underinsured motorist coverage. That means that all you're going to be able to receive is the $100,000 from the at-fault driver.
And the reason that is because the insurance company is allowed to have this reducing clause in the policy that says you get to reduce based on the amount of insurance you receive from the other driver. And because the amount of insurance you're receiving from the other driver is more than the amount of underinsured motorist coverage you have, you cannot make an underinsured motorist claim. So although you purchase $50,000 of underinsured motorist, definitionally, if the other driver has more insurance than you do, you cannot make an underinsured motorist claim. Okay, what happens in the event that the amount of insurance that the at-fault driver has, that $100,000, is the same amount of insurance that you have in underinsured motorist coverage? Well, what will happen under that example is that you still will only be able to get the $100,000 from the at-fault driver because you did not have more insurance than the at-fault driver. An easy way to look at this is the insurance companies sometimes can define underinsured motorist coverage in the policies at looking at the amount of coverage each of the drivers have first and not looking at how seriously you're injured. The last example is what happens if you have the same claim worth $150,000 if there's enough insurance. The at-fault driver has $100,000 of liability coverage, and you have $250,000 of underinsured motorist coverage. Well, under that example, you would get $100,000 from the at-fault driver. You would then be able to receive the remaining $50,000 that you'd be entitled to under your underinsured motorist provision of your policy. As you can see by this real-life example, it is so critical to buy as much insurance as you can afford to make sure that you and your family are protected in the event someone hits you and does not have enough insurance.
The last type of insurance that I want to talk about is what's called an umbrella policy. An umbrella is actually excess insurance to your automobile and actually to your home or to your renter's policy. And these policies are sold in million-dollar increments, and they will help you for liability issues. So in the event that you have a policy, a homeowner's policy, and you're involved in an accident and you have an umbrella, and the policy is, the damages are greater than your underlying liability policy, your umbrella can step in and help you and have excess insurance to that amount. So you want to make sure that when you buy an umbrella coverage that you also add an endorsement for what's called uninsured and underinsured motorist. Because when you have an umbrella policy, you can have it so it helps you with the liability if you hurt somebody, and you can also have it so if someone hurts you and doesn't have enough insurance, that you can have umbrella coverage to step in and do that as well. It's real important in today's society to make sure with these laws ever changing that if your insurance company sends you notices in the mail that you do not reject coverages without thoroughly understanding the policies. If you get these notices in the mail and you have any questions, I ask you to pick up the phone immediately and call me or one of my attorneys, because we'll be happy to spend the time with you on the phone to make sure you understand the concepts. Another important thing to think about right now is that the limits and the minimums are changing. These things constantly change. The insurance companies are for-profit companies. They want to make as much money as possible, and therefore they want to give you as little benefit as possible. Now, I'm not against insurance. I'm definitely pro-insurance. We have a real luxury in this country that if we're educated and we tell an insurance company what we want, we can protect our family in the event of a tragedy. And the luxury of being an educated consumer allows us to have this understanding before anything terrible would happen. And that is a real luxury. If we understand our policies, we understand what the terms mean, and we do a real detailed analysis of the different components, then God forbid something terrible happens to us, we know exactly what it means, rather than sitting in the hospital, waking up after having a serious accident, and then thinking, oh my goodness, what do I have? What do the terms mean? And then for the first time ever, finding out, oh no, I didn't have the right insurance, or oh no, I didn't have enough underinsured motorist, or oh no, I really hurt somebody and now my house is at risk. Don't be that person. Be educated and rely on us as a resource if you need us by calling us at 1-800-800-5678 and asking us to help you review your policies. I do it every week for people. I give this talk all over the country, and I give my time to be able to do this, and every week people take me up on this, and I'm happy to do it. I'd like to switch gears now, if I can, a little bit and talk about, God forbid you're involved in an accident and it's not your fault. What should I do? Well, the first piece of advice that I could give you is contact an attorney immediately. I would hope you'd want to contact us. We're AV rated. We're nationally board certified. You'll see us on our website, hupy.com, all the different things we've done and the big cases we've handled to get our clients excellent results. But if you're not going to contact us, you should contact a lawyer immediately. And why do I say that? There's a number of reasons. Number one, the insurance company is going to hire really nice people to do their investigation immediately to try to minimize what they're going to have to pay you. And although the insurance companies get on TV and say, you're in good hands with Allstate, we're going to take good care of you. They have all these happy sounding people on TV. The bottom line is the only way that they make money is by paying you as little as possible. They make money by accepting premiums. They do not make money by paying claims. So understand at the outset that this is an adversarial process, meaning although it's your company or you're dealing with a company for the other driver, it is adversarial. They want to pay you as little as possible. Now, if an accident happens today, how long do I have to make a claim? Well, that again varies from state to state. It can be in some states as short as 1 year. It can be as long as 6 years, depending on the type of claim you have. So earlier when I talked about liability coverage and how much should you have, when I said it may not be your assets today that are important, but your assets years from now, that's why. Because if you're involved in an accident and someone's going to the doctor, they're going to treat, they're going to wait till they either are completely better or they've plateaued and their doctor says they're not going to get any better, then they're going to look at making a claim, and that's the same we're going to do for you. So not only do you have to convalesce, but then you have the certain statute of limitations period to file the lawsuit. In Wisconsin, that's 3 years. In Illinois, that's 2 years. So as long as the lawsuit is filed in that time frame, you've perfected the statute of limitations. It doesn't have to be concluded by that time. So a lawsuit in Wisconsin could be filed up to 3 years after the accident, and that process could take another few years. So it could be up to 5 years before these assets come into play, or the assets of someone else if we're making a claim for you. There's also some rules that apply if you're suing a governmental entity that could vastly shorten those time frames. For example, you may have to file something called a notice of injury in 120 days. And if you don't do that, you may not comply with that, and you may never be able to sue a governmental entity. So contact a lawyer immediately after an accident to make sure your rights are protected. And these can vary from state to state and also vary depending on who you're making a claim against. Also, insurance companies have done a study. Allstate Insurance Company did a study showing that they have to pay 3 times more the amount of money to people who have a lawyer than people who do not. There's information about that on our website, again, hupy.com, that you can look to. There's also a concept that we have to talk about in the law called comparative negligence. And what does that mean? That means when you're involved in an accident, the insurance company or a jury, if you're ultimately going to have a trial, is going to look at the actions of both of the drivers and determine the fault of both of the drivers. And there's a real good reason as to why they're going to do that. Because the law allows them to compare the actions of both drivers, and there's an impact when that happens. For example, in most accidents that we see, it's when a vehicle may turn left in front of another vehicle. And when that happens, even if you're not at fault or you don't think you're at fault because you're driving the speed limit, you're going through a green light, you're looking out at what's happening and there's absolutely nothing you can do to avoid the accident. If your case is tried to a jury under most circumstances, a jury is going to find you a percentage of fault for that accident. And that's because the insurance company has done a real nice job of putting out this propaganda out there that you're at fault just for being there. If you'd be at a party tomorrow with your family and you'd ask everyone at the party, how many people think you're at fault just for being there involved in an accident? and ask them to show their hands or raise their hands, I'd venture to say almost everyone would raise their hands. And people are now trained to believe they're at fault for just being there in an accident, and that is not the law. But the problem with that is, if you're involved in that accident where someone turns left in front of you, and you compare the fault of you versus the other driver, it's not uncommon for you to be 15% at fault, even though you were going through a green light, even though you were not speeding. And the effect of that means that in most states, your damages are reduced by that 15%. So if you have $1,000 in medical bills and you're 15% at fault, you can only collect $850 of those. If you also lost $1,000 in wages, you'll only be able to collect $850 of the wages. If the jury or you want to settle for pain and suffering and the offer is $1,000 for that, the same thing, you can only collect $850. So it's critical after an accident to make sure you understand that the insurance company is going to want to build that case against you to pay you less. So they're going to call you after the accident and say, can I take a recorded statement? And you're going to say sure, because you don't think you did anything wrong. And they're going to ask you, do you know how fast you were going? And you're really not going to know, because if you're like most of us, we're not looking down in our speedometer the whole time. And you're going to think about what is your routine when you're operating your vehicle. And if you're like me, your routine may be going 5 miles over the posted limit. And if that happens, then you tell the insurance company you think you were probably going 5 over. You've just guaranteed yourself some negligence. And you may not have even been going 5 over, but you're just trying to be honest, you're not certain, you don't think it's any big deal because you were driving through a green, you really couldn't have done anything to avoid the accident, the other driver failed to yield the right-of-way. But the insurance company, from the inception of the accident, understands these rules and is going to try to have nice people call you and try to do whatever they can to get that number for you to be as high as possible, because it reduces every aspect of your damages. And I want to show a slide right now that talks about these different scenarios so we can understand them. And again, I want to say that some of this can vary a little bit from state to state, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But if you can see in the first slide, it shows that the plaintiff, or the injured party, is 20% at fault. It shows the defendant, the person who caused the accident, is 80% at fault. What that would mean is, if you were awarded $10,000 in total, you would only be able to claim $8,000 of your damages because it's reduced by your percentage of fault. If we switch those numbers around and we say that you're 80% at fault and the other driver is 20% at fault, what's the effect of that? Well, the effect of that in most states is you cannot collect any money. And that really makes sense, because you shouldn't be able to collect money if you're more at fault than the accident than the other driver. So if you're 80% at fault and the other driver's 20, regardless of how serious you're hurt, you cannot collect in most states. And then let's look at the last example, the 50-50. In most states, and in Wisconsin and Illinois, if you're 50% at fault for the accident, you can collect 50% of your damages. So that's really what comparative negligence is all about. And again, that's why I say this is an adversarial process from the start, because the insurance company wants to push that number as high as they can, because then they'll have to pay you less. In some states, there's something called a Contributory Negligence Bar. Not many, but some. And if you're in one of those states and you're involved in an accident, what that means is if you're even 1% at fault, you cannot collect any money. Very unfortunate, seems very unfair to me, but there are some states that have that law. There are other states that have something called no fault. And if you see on your screen, there's going to be a list of those states. And what no fault means is that in order for you to make a claim against the other driver's insurance company, you have to meet a certain threshold. In no fault states, your insurance company is going to pay the damage to your vehicle. Your insurance company is going to pay your medical bills. And if and only if you meet a threshold, are you going to be able to get compensated from the other driver for any pain and suffering. Those thresholds also differ from state to state and can vary upon the amount of medical bills. There could be a threshold number of those. You may need a threshold of a permanent injury, meaning a doctor would have to write a report and say that you are permanently injured as a result of the cause of the accident. And in those states, that's what you need before you can make any claim for pain and suffering at all against another driver. Again, I understand these are, somewhat difficult concepts, and, we're running through a lot of material here in a short period of time. But again, I encourage you, if you want, to call my office to ask us any information that you would have regarding your insurance policy. Historically, when I travel around the country or talk locally to groups about insurance, people constantly ask me, how much is enough? Who should I go to for insurance? The first question I want to talk about is, who should I go to for insurance? And the answer to that is really, it doesn't matter. Because if you're an educated consumer, you can go anywhere to get your insurance because you are telling the company what you want. You've put pencil to paper. You've thought about the first half of the insurance equation, that being liability. You've looked at your own assets, what you think your assets will be years down the road. Then you've also put on the other hat and you've looked at what you would need, God forbid something serious happened to you, what your expenditures would be, what your mortgage payments are, and you've thought about that equation and determined, how much insurance you want if someone doesn't have enough or doesn't have any at all. So if you've really done that detailed analysis that I'm suggesting, it doesn't matter the company you go to. There are a few upper echelon companies that cost more money that are used to bigger policies, but the bottom line is, if you are educated, you can buy your insurance anywhere, because with a lawyer that's willing to fight for you like we are, you can attempt to make sure you are fairly compensated. The bigger question is, how much insurance should you have? And the answer to that is, as much as you possibly can afford. For me, and I'm in this business, and I've been doing this for 17 years, and unfortunately I've seen all the devastating effects that accidents can have on my clients. I have, as you saw in my policy, underlying limits of $250, $500 on all of my vehicles. And then I have an umbrella for $5 million that has the endorsement for underinsured and uninsured on it, which means I have $5,250,000 of insurance. Now, could that cover everything that could possibly happen under all circumstances? No. Is that going to cover 99.9% of everything that could happen? Yes, it is. Now, I don't expect everyone to have $5 million of insurance. I understand that's not realistic. But I do know that most people out there could have more insurance than they have, and the only reason they don't is because they don't understand the ramifications, and unfortunately a lot of them find out too late. So, what is enough? Anything under $1 million is nowhere near enough. And to get to that $1 million, quite honestly, is not that expensive. And how do you get there? The first thing you have to do is you have to buy umbrella coverage. And I understand when I'm talking about this insurance that everybody is under a budget. And I'm respectful for a budget, and I'm going to talk about ways that we can use our budget to maximize the amount of insurance. The most important thing you can do after you watch this video is go home, grab your policy, look at it to determine what you purchased, and then immediately get on the phone with your insurance agent and buy more insurance. Look for an umbrella. Umbrellas that are sold in those $1 million increments that we talked about are very inexpensive ways to buy more insurance. So look at the limits. In most circumstances, an insurance company will require that you have $100, $300 to get an umbrella. So if by chance you had $250, $500, one thing you can do is reduce your underlying limits to $100, $300, and then buy the umbrella. Then instead of having $250,000 of coverage, you have $1,100,000 of coverage. Another thing you can do to get that adequate coverage is you can increase your deductibles on the collision and comprehensive. If you're really not going to make a claim, if you have less than $1,000 of damage, then why have a deductible for less than $1,000? You are much better off in the long run having higher deductibles and bigger limits than lower deductibles and smaller limits. If you're on a motorcycle, for example, MedPay coverage is very expensive because if you're involved in an accident on a motorcycle, the likelihood of being seriously injured is pretty great. So maybe get rid of the MedPay coverage on a motorcycle if you have budgetary constraints. If not, and you want some of that for co-pays or deductibles, keep it on there. But it is much more important to have higher limits than it is to have lower deductibles or, for example, MedPay on a policy. I would say if you have a $1 million umbrella with the underinsured and uninsured endorsement, with at least 100, 300 of coverage, you are adequately insured. Now that may change from person to person depending on when you sit down, put pencil to paper, and look at your specific asset situation and obligations, and what you want to protect your family for. You have to sit down and really go through that kind of a detailed analysis to determine how much insurance you want. And when you call that agent of yours, make sure you call your agent and tell your agent what you want. Unfortunately, I have found sometimes that when my people that see my video, or even myself when I've called agents and said I want this and I want that, they try to dissuade me from getting more insurance, which is really unfortunate. And a lot of that comes from the fact that to buy these higher limits of insurance is really not that expensive. I've had staff members, after hearing my talk, go out and buy insurance and raise the deductible, and their insurance premiums actually have gone down. If all the consumers out there were educated, the insurance companies would not get substantially more premiums for the bigger policies, but they'd have a heck of a lot more risk. That's why I find in this arena we very rarely get called from our agents selling us more auto insurance or umbrella coverage. But for those of us that may have disability insurance or life insurance, we constantly get those calls. That's the reason why, because I don't think the insurance companies really want the consumers to be educated, because then people would have more insurance and then they would have more risk. In sum, in talking about what's an adequate amount of insurance, it's as much as you possibly can afford. Protect yourself, don't rely on others, and in the unlikely event a tragedy happens, you will know what you have and what it means to you. I like to end these presentations with a real-life story of a situation where I represented a client, because I think it really hits home both aspects of what we've talked about. I was representing a young man who was seriously injured in a motorcycle accident. A woman turned left in front of him, causing a serious ankle injury. He made a smart decision and he contacted me right away. I immediately met with him, signed him up, and I was ready, willing, and able to do whatever it took to get him fairly compensated. As in every case where I represent somebody seriously injured, I first get the information that my client has. The first thing I did was take a look at my client's policies to see that in the event the other driver was not responsible, what kind of insurance he had purchased to protect himself. As you can see by looking at the policy, the first thing that struck me was that the policy was actually in his mother's name. His mother had a motorcycle license, but it was not her motorcycle. Never, ever insure a vehicle in somebody else's name. The insurance company is entitled to get the premium for the appropriate risk. In a lot of ways, I'm critical against insurance companies because I don't think they educate consumers appropriately. But in this circumstance, I believe they're entitled to get the appropriate premium for the risk. You may think you're saving money by putting your 16-year-old child's car in your name, and you may be saving money on the premium, but in the event an accident happens, there may be no coverage at all because the insurance company did not get the appropriate risk. You can also see the limits that are on the policy. And those limits were 50, 100, 50. What that means, as you learned earlier, is that no one person can get more than $50,000, and then most of the insurance company will pay, regardless of how many people are injured, is $100,000. You can also see by looking at this policy that there was no underinsured motorist coverage at all. So in the event the other driver does not have enough insurance, my client did not buy any underinsured motorist. A very big mistake. Given the fact that those insurance policies were in someone else's name, I also looked at the other policies that were in the household. As you can see, there was another vehicle that had the same limits, but this vehicle had underinsured motorist. So as you can see, between these two policies, there are different levels of coverage. One policy has underinsured motorist. Another policy does not. And the way these policies were developed really doesn't make sense because you are more likely to be injured if you're on a motorcycle than if you're in a car. And so the injury portion may be more important if you're on your motorcycle than if you're in a car. And on that motorcycle policy, there was no underinsured motorist to protect him in the event the other driver was not responsible. So the next step was for me to look at the insurance policy for the other driver. And as you can see on that policy, the other driver had the same coverage, $50,000, $100,000. So that means that the other driver also may have not been responsible and only carried $50,000 of coverage. My client's claim was worth substantially more than $50,000. People ask me all the time then, what happens if there isn't enough insurance? And the reality of the circumstances is, if the person that hurts you doesn't have enough, and you didn't buy enough to protect yourself under those circumstances, you are more than likely going to be out of luck. Because the likelihood of being able to find someone that doesn't have the right insurance, but also has assets, is very slim. But I just don't give up if there isn't enough insurance. So what I did in this case was I sent a letter to the other driver saying, you don't have enough insurance, give me a list of all your assets. Now, no one wants to be in that situation where they get a letter from a lawyer where they didn't have enough insurance and they have to now start looking at providing their asset information. This was an 80-year-old woman. She was a retired forestry worker at the time. Normally, under these circumstances, I get back a letter that says I don't own anything. Surprisingly, in this case, I got back a letter from a lawyer with a detailed listing of her assets. First of all, this woman owned half interest in a home because she was widowed, and her children owned the other half. Her value in the home was about $40,000. She had personal property worth about $5,000. Another car, as you can see, worth $8,300. She had about $40,000 in the bank. She had an investment account of over $213,000 and about $100,000 in other assets. Here was a woman that had assets that she in no way protected by buying $50,000 of insurance. The moral of this story, ladies and gentlemen, is don't be my client who didn't buy enough insurance to protect himself in the event something bad happened. Don't be the person that retired, worked their whole life to accumulate these assets, and then gets a letter from me trying to take those assets because they don't have enough insurance. Do I like to take money from retired, widowed forestry workers? No. But will I fight to get every single nickel that my client deserves as a result of an accident? You're darn right I will. So please, ladies and gentlemen, don't be the person that's injured, that wasn't an educated consumer, that didn't buy the right amount of insurance to protect themselves. And also, don't be the person that works your whole life, accumulates these assets, and then has them at risk. In this case, I was able to take over $100,000 of those assets for my client. I want to thank you very much for listening to this video. I want to encourage you, as I've said throughout this video, to call myself or any of my attorneys in the event you have questions about your policies. You know, it's our pleasure to represent injured people in Wisconsin and Illinois and throughout this great nation. We will fight tooth and nail to make sure you get every dollar you're entitled to. And we are here for injured people. That's all we do. We live, eat, and breathe these type of cases all day long. I encourage you to watch, following this video, some programs that were done by the Insider exclusive TV show about some exciting, groundbreaking cases that myself and my law firm have worked on, and I hope you find it educational. And if you have any other questions, feel free to call me at 1-800-800-5678 and go to hupy.com for more information about my law firm. Thank you so much.